Okay, you know, the lesson today will be about the definition of a species. You're going to discuss the species concept from different points of view, and then the limitation of a species model, and identifying a species. So how can we know the species? Okay, the concept of a species was very important for the biologist for many reasons. Number one, species numbers are used to measure the biodiversity. We explained this part last lesson. If we know the number of species in an ecosystem or an environment, so we will be able to measure the degree of biodiversity that you'll learn about it by the end of the lesson. Two, changes in species help monitor the effect of both natural environmental changes and the changes due to human activity. So if you know the number of species, so you can measure the change. Measuring the change lets you to know the effect of the environment or of human on the natural environment. Three, biologists look for adaptation within a species and for changes in their types and the numbers. Look for adaptation within species. So if you have a species, you know, in any living in any community, there are a number of species that are living together and interacting. If you have a species of the living organism, also we need to know the behavioral pattern of the living organisms, how they breed, how they reproduce, how they take their food, how they take care of their youngs. So if you know also a number of species and study their adaptations, we'll be able to know the changes that can happen in their types and in their numbers. And then biologists need to know how to identify or how to unify the model of the species. We said that species now we need to unify the language when we talk about a species of living organism. Did you get this point? There were two models of species. The first model of species we call it the morphological species concept. Morphological species concept were used from the time of Linnaeus, the Greek philosopher. So long time ago, the definition of species was as per Linnaeus model. We explained last lesson that the Linnaeus model depended in his definition on the appearance of the organism, only on the morphology of the organism, internal and external. So we can refer to the shape of the living organism, to the shape of the limbs, the skull, some of the internal features, and also the external features. We call both of them physical properties. Physical, we mean here the internal and external morphology of the living organism. After Linnaeus put his model, of course, 500 years after Linnaeus, people were able to know more details about the structure of the cell and the DNA and the relation between a living organism based on their DNA structures. So there were many limitations for Linnaeus model. The first limitation, we call it sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism, you can see two living organisms that look different, not because they belong to different species, but because they are sexually different. Like if you look for the male and female lion, they look different from each other, not because they belong to different species, but because they have different function in their environment. And also there is variation within species, like between me and you and your siblings, there are variations. So we cannot also consider both of you belong to a different species. There were the limitation that were in Linnaeus model. Did you get the limitation? Okay. Okay. Linnaeus based in his classification on the morphology of the organism. Morphology, we mean external and internal features. But after putting his model, it has shown some limitations, some problems. The first one, we call it sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism, if you look at the peacock, you can look in the book. Did you see the picture of the male and female peacock in the book? Yeah, they look different. The big one is the male, the small one is the female. Page 251. 251. Okay, so they are different in appearance. But according to Carlinius, if they have different morphology, we should put them into different species. But we can't because they can interbreed. And they belong to the same species and they give fertile offsprings. Did you get the point? Sexual dimorphism? Yes, of course, they are the same organism, same species. Just different due to male and female, being a male or being a female. This is the only difference. The only difference between them in the looking, in the appearance. Because one of them is the male and one is the female. Okay? Okay, the second one, variation within the species. Like variation between you and your sibling, your mother, your father, you look different because of the normal genetic variation. So also we cannot put them into different species or many different species. Okay? I did not go to this definition. I'm just explaining the first definition now. The morphological species concept. I didn't go to the second point. I explained only Linnaeus model and its limitation. Okay? The second model, we call it reproductive model or biological species model or concept. This is based on the reproductive behavior of the organism. So they depend on classification of species if the living organism is capable to reproduce or not. If the two living organisms can reproduce and produce fertile offspring, so we put them in one species. This is why we call this model reproductive species concept. Okay, so it depends on the ability of the organism to reproduce or the behavior of the organism during reproduction. It has an advantage because it overcomes the issues like sexual dimorphism that were in Linnaeus model. So here, because we can see varieties of living organisms in the same species can reproduce, and also male and female of the same species can reproduce. So in this way, we overcome the problems of the Linnaeus model. But it still has some limitation also. Number one, interbreeding may not be attemptable. Sometimes, because I will show you now some examples, sometimes you can see two living organisms, they look similar and they can interbreed, but they don't produce offsprings. Or sometimes the interbreeding is not accessible. Suppose the male and female are living in different areas or they are very far away, so they will not interbreed. So in this way, we cannot make sure that they belong to the same species or to a different species because they didn't try to interbreed. Did you get the point? Some living organisms live in different geographical areas. Male and female, they are separated by barriers, so they can't reproduce, even though they belong to the same species. This was one of the limitations of the reproductive model. Okay? Fine. Go to the next point. Different what? Salah, I think he did not get. First one is not about the limitation was about different gender. The second one, the limitation is because they cannot interbreed. They cannot meet. They live in different areas. They are separated by barriers in their environment. Like if a mountain has appeared and separate a land into two different areas, so the male on one side of the land cannot meet the female on the other side of the of the land, although they belong to the same species. Okay, يعني they can't interbreed because they didn't try. Okay. Mm. Yes, advantage of biological concept overcome the problems of the morphological concept, overcome the sexual dimorphism, and overcome the variation within species. Sexual dimorphism is overcome here because the two different organisms, the two different genders, they can reproduce. So we do not depend on, in our classification or in our definition, on the morphology. We depended only on their ability to reproduce, regardless the sexual dimorphism and regardless the variation within species. Okay. You can see here the sexual dimorphism in birds, in the one at the bottom. Okay. They are male and female. They look different. Okay. So according to morphological definition, they are different species or one species. Guys, diagram at the bottom, the picture at the bottom. Yeah, I'm asking you, as per the morphological definition, we consider them belong to the same species or different species? No, different species. According to the morphological definition, they belong to different species. You can see this picture. Well, it depends on which definition you are on. If the morphology, you can see the picture now, sir. You can see the picture, the male and female. Why? So sexual dimorphism describe differences in the physical characteristics of the two sexes. Okay. So you have seen here some photos for male and female. Why? Wait. Okay. So just a minute. You can see anything now? I'm opening other windows. Hmm. I don't know. طيب اوكي حاضر. screen recording screen. And now you see my laptop, huh? The desktop. I think it's a blurry. It's a يعني. Wow. Yeah. I think because I make a screen recording, I will stop the screen recording. Yes. But just 1 second. What you can see now? Is it? How see? Can you refresh or do something? You want me to end? Okay. No, Salah is only on. Okay. Yes, I'm meeting. Now can you see the screen better? It's clear now? Is it clear now? بس it's good. خلاص now okay, you can see these two, but now how many are in the meeting? I will send the code. How many are in now? Mm. طب shall I continue? Wait. Guys, this code is something else. Wait. This code is not, it's not, it's for the application I'm using. It's not for the video. No, I can't end the meeting. يعني, but I mean the link I sent is not correct. It's for the whiteboard, not for. Guys, يعني we are wasting time. Mariam Ahmed, are you here? طيب كويس خلاص. when I started a new one. ما انا مش بعمل كوبي، مش بعمل كوبي اجي اعمل بيست ما بتيجي. والله العظيم يا رب. بتيجي كده لان الميتنج از اون، مش جايه ان هي لينك. I don't know. I think anyone can join، صح؟ سهيلة is here. خلاص. طيب خلاص اوكي. طيب خلاص. So share the screen. Can you see the screen, the presentation one? طيب. I think الانترنت ضعيفة النهارده يعني. المرة اللي فاتت كانت أحسن. بس خلاص I don't want to stop، يعني خلينا نخلص لغاية الآخر. Okay, now you can see the screen، صح؟ خلاص خلاص فهمنا خلاص sexual dimorphism، مش محتاجة سؤال تاني، شرح تاني، صح؟ Sexual dimorphism, can you see, may you read the definition, Tala? Read it loud. A species is defined as the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, in this way, genes can flow from the parents to offspring. So you can see two different animals that look different, okay, but they can interbreed. Here, the horse and pony. Horse and pony, they are two different species, but they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So we can consider this as a limitation for the reproductive definition of species. Did you get the point? Reproductive definition of species is saying that any organism that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they belong to the same species. But now, according to the binomial system naming living organism, the name of the horse is different from the name of the pony. They have different behavior, different physical and internal and external features, but they can interbreed. However, the horse and donkey, if they are crossed or if they mate, they will never produce a fertile offspring, or in most of the cases, they don't produce fertile offspring. So here we can say that there is a conflict in the definition of species. We have two different organisms, they reproduce and produce fertile offspring, and on the other side, we have two different organisms that when they reproduce, when they mate, they never produce a fertile offspring. This was a very important point of misconception in the biological definition of species. Yeah, they have different names. Yeah. They are very far. They are very far in, and we can say a very far species, or sorry, a very far variety, a very far variety, same species but very far variety. So it has got a different name, but they can interbreed, producing fertile offsprings. And other two, they have different names. They cannot reproduce. Okay. So we can summarize here the species definition. Organism from two different species may mate and produce fertile offsprings. Okay, like here, this mating can take place and produce fertile offspring, although they belong to different species. The same like the horse and pony. So scientists have put more definitions of species based on the reproductive capabilities. Two new definitions. Okay, number one, group of organisms with similar characteristics that are all potentially capable of breeding to produce fertile offsprings. Two, group of organisms in which genes flow between individuals. So the reproductive definition of species depend on similarities in characteristics. They are capable to breed, produce fertile offsprings, and the genes can flow between individuals. The reproductive concept of species is a good working model for most animals, but is most less helpful in classifying plants because sometimes they can't produce fertile offsprings. So they were useful in animals and less in plants. Species, other definition of species that based on molecular phylogeny. What is molecular phylogeny? Tala, may you read the definition? Okay. Yeah, so what we understand by the structure of molecules. What molecules we are concerned with? Mainly the proteins and DNA. So we classify the living organism, or we can put the evolutionary relationship between organisms based on the similarities and the differences in their protein structure and the DNA structure. We call this molecular phylogeny, means the classification based on molecules, based on the structure of molecules. We can have here three definitions. The first one, we call it ecological species model, based on ecological niche occupied by an organism. So where the organism lives. This is not a robust way of identifying species, as niche definitions vary, and many species occupy more than one niche. So this is also a limitation for this definition, because the definition of niche even varies between, if you open the Wikipedia, looking for the definition of niche, you'll find many different species, many different definitions for niche. Some people define niche as a relationship between living organisms. Some people define niche as the space, like something like ecosystem, where the organism live, or like a community. So the definition is varied. And also, some species may occupy more than one niche, like a human being. Human being can live in all kinds of niche worldwide. So the ecological species model is not very accurate because it depends on the occupation of the living organism. Where does the living organism live? What we call ecological niche. Two, mate recognition species model, a concept based on unique fertilization systems, including mating behavior, fertilization system. So we are comparing the fertilization system or reproductive system in two or three different organisms. And based on that, we put them on the same species or in different species. Mating behavior, how they mate. Difficulty in that many species will mate with or cross-pollinate other species, and may even produce fertile offsprings, but are nevertheless different species. So we can, like you have studied in plants, that cross-pollination can happen in plants. And in many cases, cross-pollination can be also successful. And this is how we can produce plants of large size. to produce maize or corn of very large size. They make cross-pollination between two different species. Now most of the food that we eat and fruits that we eat, they are produced by cross-pollination. So they are different species. So this means that this system of classification was not also accurate. Made recognition species model. Because if cross-pollination happened between two different species, so this model is not accurate at all. And also different species that the mating that can happen between different species of animals, this also will make this concept is not accurate. So if a donkey and horse can mate even without looking at they reproduce or not, but they can mate, according to this model, we put them in the same species. Okay? If you look for the reproductive system of horse and donkey, if you look at the mating behavior, and if they can mate or not, we can say yes, yes, yes. But they don't belong to the same species because they cannot reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Did you get the point? Okay? Right. This definition looks only for what? For unique fertilization system, if they have the same fertilization system, and if they share the mating behavior. So if they share the system and share the behavior, they put them in the same species. Okay? Regardless if they can produce fertile offspring or not. They didn't look for this point in this definition. Okay, in the third one, genetic species model. Okay, this one, it looks more accurate. It's based on the DNA evidence. This might seem ultimate reliable method of determining species, but people still have to decide how much genetic difference is needed for two organisms to be members of different species. If you look for my DNA and you look and your DNA, they are different, but both of us belong to the same species. So scientists need to decide at which point, at what degree we can consider these two organisms belong to the same species or not, for how much similarity they are looking for. Collecting DNA was difficult and it took long time and cost a lot of money to analyze. As DNA analysis continue to get faster and cheaper, this will become the main way of classifying organisms. So the idea of classifying organism now depend only on the DNA structure. That's what we call here molecular phylogeny. Molecular phylogeny, the similarities of molecules. And the most important molecule is the DNA. DNA, when we talk about DNA, we are not looking at the shape of the DNA, we're looking at what? The base sequences, right? We look for the similarities of base sequences. This is the main idea. Similarities in the sequences of nitrogenous bases on the DNA structure. If they are very similar, so we put them in the same species. But the limitation is the scientists need to decide how much genetic difference is needed for the two organisms to consider them into different species. This model has some limitations. Okay, all the ways to define species has limitations. Who can read those? Is it clear? Sorry. Okay. Thank you. So the main idea here, these are some limitations for all the definitions of species. Number one, um, number one, finding the evidence. So many living species have never been observed mating, because if you look for the mating level, the definition based on the mating behavior, we did not see all the living organisms mating. And this is true if the new species is found that is similar to an existing species. Setting up a breeding program is time consuming and expensive and may not prove anything. Breeding program, so if we can arrange or schedule a time for breeding between different organisms to monitor the breeding behavior. This is very difficult to be accessible or to be applied. Secondly, plants of different but closely related species, they can interbreed and produce fertile hybrids. This, as I told you, now we have maize and corn, very large size. They make breeding between peach and um, what's the other one? Peach and apples. They make breeding between them. They are different, but they are closely related. When should the hybrid themselves be regarded as separate species? So now scientists, they don't know. They can put the hybrid as a separate species or the same species. Number three, many organisms don't reproduce sexually. So how can we define the species then? If all the definitions were based on the ability of reproduction or mating behavior, so how can we define the species in protista or fungi or bacteria? This will be, of course, a problem. Number four, fossil organisms. The organisms that we have seen them in fossils, we cannot relate them to any other species, and because their DNA is inaccessible. Okay, very, very few fossils that they can found their DNA, like the mummies. But others, all fossils, organisms, we can't see any DNA for them. So also to be very difficult to classify them. The mummies, that like the pharaohs, the pharaohs, Cleopatra, yeah, they have their DNA. Okay, so we can know their DNA, but not for other fossil organisms. I'm starting it, but I don't know why it's not start it.
I think humans have an inbuilt need to classify the world around them.
No sound?
We do it with music, we do it with food, we do it with art, and that's what the science of taxonomy really does. Taxonomy is the science of naming, describing, and then classifying the living world around us. Taxonomy isn't just about naming all the species that we found, it's also about ordering them, it's about grouping them together. And we group them together based on shared characteristics. So if a group of animals show shared characters, we may think that they evolved from a common ancestor, and that's why we group them closely together. The work of a taxonomist is never really done. As we discover new species, or we discover more about older known species, often these names change to reflect this new information. Nautilus are one of the groups that I look after here at the Natural History Museum, and they're a really interesting group. When you first look at the shells of these species, they look very, very similar. But if you look a bit more closely, you can see some of the differences. So the umbilicus, the central part of this, varies in shape and size. And as we notice these changes, as we understand them more, then we can change the taxonomic names around them, because this gives us a better clue to their evolutionary history. Taxonomy is never really finished. We just get a step closer to the truth. When I first started working at the museum, and working on the collections, I had no idea that, the taxonomic work that goes on here had so many amazing applications. Things like disease prevention, conservation, ecology, food security, pest management, and even things like discovering new drugs from deep sea animals or Amazonian plants. There really is no end to the importance of taxonomy.
Okay, guys? Did you hear, or the sound was poor? Okay, no problem. When I send you the link later on, this link, the code, you can watch it again. Okay, he was showing that some living organisms, some species, they are different species, they can interbreed, and he was explaining how classifying the living organisms based on the similarities and differences in their morphological characteristics. That's it. Okay. You can look for the DNA. The way that you are looking and comparing the DNA between living organisms of two different species or two different varieties, we call it DNA profiling. So DNA profiling uses repetitive sequences that are highly variable. We call it variable number tandem repeats. What is this? If you look for if you analyze the DNA of living organisms, you can see there are some patterns that are repeated so many times on the same DNA molecule. The pattern which is repeated so many times, we call it variable number tandem repeats. Okay? It was found that the organisms that are very similar have similar pattern of their VNTR, variable number tandem repeat. They are very similar between closely related humans or between closely related living organisms. The analysis of variable number tandem repeats to detect the degree of relatedness to another sequence of oligonucleotides, making them ideal for DNA fingerprinting. We'll explain later on DNA fingerprinting. DNA profiling is a part of DNA fingerprinting. But did you understand what they mean by variable number tandem repeats? No. I will show you. Yes. I'm sharing the screen so you can see the screen, right? Look here, or this one. These are the patterns of the DNA. When we make DNA fingerprinting, you can see the pattern of DNA, something like this. Okay? We can have the DNA pattern for different species of the organism. So we can consider those are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species of the organism, or 7 organisms, 7 different organisms. Okay, like father, mother, brother, and siblings, and someone else in the family, and these are all their DNA fingerprinting. So how can we know the relatedness of these living organisms to one another? By looking for VNTR, variable number tandem repeat, the pattern which is repeated in all of them. Okay, so we can say, for example, can you see any patterns here? Can you see this line? This line is repeated here. So in line number 2 and line number 5, the same line is repeated. Same pattern. Not what? Yes, not all of them, because they are not exactly the same. Yeah, they will be the same only if you have an identical twins only. We are looking for the pattern which is repeated in different organisms. The pattern which is repeated. Okay, so you can see that the first and last one First and last one, I think these are like references. First and last one are references. Looking for the ones in the center. The ones in the center. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. 8 is similar to which one? No. Yeah, it has some pattern. Yeah, one line is repeated. And the second line, the blue line is repeated like this. So they have some similarities. I can see the screen, the other one. Where is my screen? Can you see the screen that has a presentation? I can't see it. You can see it? What is it? You see now the variable number tandem repeat, right? You can see some patterns are repeated and some others are not. So here is the schematic of variable number tandem repeat in 4 alleles. The 1, 2, 3, there are 4 alleles. Some of these patterns, like here, 1, 2, 3, 4, they are repeated, 1, 2, 3. So 3 patterns are repeated and the others are different. Did you get the point? Okay, here also in this one, you can see that are some patterns that are exactly the same and repeated between 2 individuals, like this and that. Okay, and what else? Yeah, the 3 of them, they are in the same row, so they are similar in this tandem repeat. But the others are not similar, so I cannot find any similarity for this, for example. These are parts of the DNA. When we analyze the DNA, break it down into fragments. Yes, different organisms may belong to the same species, but because it's saying here 6 individuals, so they mean the same species. Okay. So they have some similarities and some differences. Based on that, the molecular phylogeny is dependent. In the book. It is just given in page 254, but he didn't put any diagram, he just explained. 254. The book writes the definitions of them only. I can't see the whiteboard. Actually, I will stop sharing and share again because the board disappeared. We may take like 30 minutes more. 30 minutes. Okay. Okay, now you got the idea of variable number tandem repeats, huh? خلاص, these are repeated sequence of the DNA that shows the relationship between the living organisms. DNA sequencing is a technique which used to determine the nucleotide sequence in the DNA, the exact nucleotides. Okay, the sequence of nucleotides is A, T, C, G, like this. Nucleotide sequence is the most fundamental level of knowledge of a gene or a genome. It's the blueprint that contains the instructions for building an organism. And no understanding of genetic function or evolution could be completed without obtaining this information. So if you need to study the evolution, in more details or more scientific way, we need to understand the sequencing of DNA in the whole genome. Genome is the total of our genes. So if we will be able to encode all the sequences of the DNA in our genome, so we can study the evolutionary relationship between different living organisms. And this has been done already. And then, why do we need to do this? Why this is important for biologists? You know, the whole lesson is about like 5, 6 definitions for species. Why biologists are concerned with the definition of species? And this is because the organisms, we said there are so many names for living organisms, because the organisms live worldwide. We need to unify the language of describing organisms. We need to learn about the behavior of the organism, like mating behavior or any other behavioral pattern of the organisms. Okay. Right. Question 2. Why is it so important to be able to identify individual species? To study what? Evolutionary relationship. Yeah, this is the main idea of evolutionary relationship between organisms. Yes. Um, okay, then number 3, compare the advantage and practical difficulties of using classic morphology, reproductive capability, DNA analysis to decide if an organism belongs to a particular species. And I prefer to take like 5 minutes or 3 minutes to think about the answer of this question, because you need to compare the advantage and the limitation of the classic morphology, which is the first method, reproductive capability, the second concept, and DNA analysis, which is the molecular phylogeny. For first one, classic morphology, what is the advantage? Is Ala here? Ala. طيب, Ala, can you tell me the advantage of the first method, the classic morphology? Classic morphology, classic morphology based on what? Yes. We want to analyze the definition itself. What is the advantage of it? It was important to put the organisms that are physically the same in the same group, right? In the same species. This was its advantage. We put the organisms that look physically the same externally and internally in the same species. But this will be this is the limitation. This is the difficulty. This is the difficulty of this model. The advantage, if when you put two different organisms here in classical morphology, if two different organisms, we put them in two different groups. but it was having with and here many problems arise. Like, what is the disadvantage here? Yeah, what we call, and also there was something we call sexual, sexual dimorphism. Yes, this is the difficulty of of the morphological model, sexual dimorphism. If the male and female look different, okay, so they will create a problem. Can we put them in the same species or not? Sorry? No, no, we are still in number one, classic morphology. So in the advantage of classic morphology, so we put the organism that look similar in the same species, that they share their external and internal features. The disadvantage, one of them is sexual dimorphism. The second one is varieties. Varieties within the same species. You and your colleague, they look different, but both of you belong to the same species. So there was a conflict depending on this definition. Can we put them in the same species or not? So varieties were creating a problem in the classic morphology model. The second model is reproductive capability. Reproductive capability. So the reproductive species concept. What is the advantage and disadvantage? Yalla. Yes, this is the advantage. Thank you. And what is the disadvantage here? Yes, yeah, different species can interbreed. Yes, okay, and some species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And you can give the example of the lion and the horse and pony, right? Or also lion and tiger. Lion and tiger can interbreed and produce a fertile animal, which is liger. Okay, liger, lion and tiger. Yeah, liger is the product of lion and tiger. And I want to remove this. Okay. Who? I don't know all the names yet. Okay. طيب, and what was the problem in here? You said, right? One problem. There is another problem, I think, with the reproductive capability. We said cross-pollination. We said that it works well for animals, but not for plants, because cross-pollination can happen between two different species and also produce what we call a hybrid. We call it hybrid vigor. We call it hybrid vigor. It happens in plants. We can have two plants from two different species cross-pollinated and produce an organism which has larger size than both parents. طبعا we don't know if the new organism or the hybrid belong to the same species, so we can put it in either of the two species or we can put it in a new species. So it's a point of conflict. Like I will give you an example. Like if you have corn, if you have a plant which has 4 N chromosome, and we cross it with another plant which has 6 N chromosome. Okay, The result was a hybrid, a Vigor, which has 10 N chromosomes. So to which species do we belong this organism? Because there were two different species. This is species 1 and species 2. So the scientists have a conflict. Can we put this in species 1 or 2, or we can put it in a new species, according to the reproductive capability definition? Did you get the point of misconception? This is also a point. So the third point, which is DNA analysis. Okay, what is the benefit and what is also the difficulty of the DNA analysis? We mean the molecular phylogeny. Yeah, thank you. So yes, we have two ideas. We have the sequencing. Right, the sequencing, so we can know the relationship or the relatedness of the living organism, and we have the VNTR, variable number tandem repeat. This is also a sequence of DNA. It's a sequence of DNA, but it's based on density. It does not based on the base sequence. And the difference between the sequencing and the NTR sequencing, we are looking for the real sequence, A, T, C, H, G, like this. But the VNTR is looking for the we can say allele. It's allele, which depends on the density, like the whole allele, not for each sequence. But also both of them look for the similarities and the relatedness of the living organism. But what is the problem here? What is the difficulty? What do you think? What is the problem in studying the sequence or the similarities of the DNA to define species? We know it's the most accurate one, but even though it has also some limitations. It's saying yes, expensive, takes a lot of time to know the sequence. What else? We said also scientists need to decide at which point we can group the two living organisms in two different groups or two different species. Because we are just saying similarity. What is the point of similarity? Is it 90%, 99%, 99.9%? So the scientists need to decide at which point they should separate the living organisms into two different species. Okay? Now we are done with the lesson.